Welcome to the screencast for 17.1, the nervous system. We're going to be looking at something called a neuron, and another name for a neuron is the nerve cell. So we're going to be looking at neurons, different types of neurons, how impulses are transmitted. We're going to be identifying the parts of the central nervous system and others. So let's take a look. Look at this sentence here. The nervous system is a complex network of nervous tissue that carries electrical messages throughout the body. And to understand how the messages can travel so quickly, we need to know about nerve cells. So that's what we're going to be talking about, nerve cells or neurons. This diagram we're going to have a number of times, so we're going to see a number of times, we're also going to see it in the quiz, is a stylized version of a neuron or a nerve cell. This is the nucleus right here. This is the cell body over here. But right here, starting here, and the red part traveling through here is called the axon. And over here is the end of the axon terminal. It'll be important that you analyze most of the parts of this and understand them. On one side of the neuron are things called dendrites. On the opposite side is the axon terminal. And as we said, this is the axon itself, but you'll notice that these blue structures around the axon, and they are called the Schwann cells. So we'll be looking at each of these and what they do. Now, not like the bones that I asked you to memorize, I don't want you to memorize the nerves and the specialized nerves in the body, but I do want you to note how they are put together. So we have the brain up here, which leads into a spinal cord which goes all the way down our back. Incredibly important. Feeding the messages from the brain, they come down the spinal cord and they branch out into different nerves. These are the large nerves in the body. They branch into even smaller nerves to go to the individual muscles or whatever structure they need to go to. There are three types of neurons or three types of nerve cells. Let's take a look at the first one, the sensory neurons. They carry nerve impulses, electrical impulses from the tissue and organs to the spinal cord and brain. So for example, these sensory neurons would carry a message, let's say from your finger, if your finger got pinched, up into the nerves, into the central nervous system, and up into the brain. The motor neurons carry impulses from the brain and the spinal cord to the muscles and glands. And in between these two types, in between the sensory and the motor, are interneurons. They carry nerve impulses back and forth between the sensory and the motor neurons. Remember, wherever you see the term neuron, we're talking about a nerve cell. This page in our text reminds us that nerve impulses are electrical in nature. We talked about that a little beginning in the welcome to this chapter. Remember, they are measured in millivolts, the result from a difference in electrical charge across a membrane. We'll see that in a few minutes. How does this difference in electrical charge come about? It involves ions. Remember, ions are electrically charged atoms or molecules. When there is not an impulse coming down a nerve, and an impulse is a very fast, very quick thing, when there is no impulse coming down, that's referred to as the resting potential. So there's no impulse coming down. Let's take a look at the next slide in our presentation. So here we see those ions. We see what's called the sodium-potassium pump, and sodium is in Na here. Sodium is the plus ion, and potassium another positive ion, and they move back and forth across this to establish, either to keep the resting potential, to keep it balanced, or they will flip in charge in a few minutes if an impulse comes down. So here's another way of looking at resting potential versus action potential. Action potential is another name for the impulse itself. So in this action potential, it speeds along the axon in milliseconds, thousands of seconds. And note over here, the membrane potential is measured in millivolts. Looks like somewhere between 0 and 40 millivolts and 0 and negative 80 millivolts. Notice what happens with normally inside the axon, it's negatively charged, but when that impulse comes down, look, it flips. It goes to instead of being negative on the inside, it becomes positive. And on the outside, instead of becoming positive, it it was positive, it becomes negative. So this is the impulse running down very, very quickly. Let's see if we can look at that in an animation that I'll set up for you now. So let's take a look at what we have here. We have a cross-section of a nerve. This is a cross-section of an axon. And notice that inside, these are negative charges right here. Inside the axon, it's normally negatively charged, and outside, you can see these positive charges. And that's maintained by the sodium and the potassium ions. And if you take a look at this legend right here, you can see the sodium ions are the little red spheres, the potassium are the greenish triangle-like shapes, and then there are gated channels of different colors. These are proteins embedded into the axon membrane. So what we're going to do now is we're going to hit stimulate neuron, and you'll see an impulse. Right now we're at resting potential. You're going to see an impulse come down here, and when it hits right here, you're going to see these symbols go away, because for a split second, the inside will be positive and the outside will be negative. So let's hit stimulate and watch what happens. So here comes our impulse. Boom, it hits it. It goes away, the ions move in and out, and then it returns very quickly to negative and positive. But for a split second, it's just the opposite. It's positive on the inside and negative on the outside. This is a simulation from PhET, and PhET is a wonderful organization with lots of great simulations for science, and I'll link this on the presentation. So we took a quick look at that nerve impulse coming down a neuron, and when that impulse hits the end of the axon, it hits a synapse and it transfers that information right at the synaptic opening. The synapse is really, really important. Now, let's take a look at one of the most important organs in the body, the brain. And the brain works with electricity and transfers those simple, amazing signals. It consists of an astonishing 100 billion neurons, or 100 billion nerve cells. And it contains such mental processes as reasoning, imagination, memory, language. And very importantly, it also interprets information about the senses, from your ears, from your eyes, from your sense of touch. All of these are interpreted through electrical signals by your brain. Each half of your brain is referred to as a hemisphere. There's the right half side of your brain and the left half side. So we're looking sideways here. So let's just say we're looking at the left side of the brain here. So each lobe is associated with a particular brain function. For example, the frontal lobe has to do with thinking and reasoning. The temporal lobe has to do with hearing. The parietal lobe has to do with touch, and the occipital lobe has to do with sight. So for the quiz, I'd like you to know which one of these parts, the parietal touch, frontal reasoning, temporal hearing, occipital sight. This particular diagram will be on the quiz. It's really important that you know those parts of the brain. So take a look at this diagram. These are the nerves of the peripheral nervous system. They're shown in blue. So all of these nerves coming off of here. This is the central nervous system with the brain and with the spinal cord coming off the brain. There's a couple types of nervous systems. One is the somatic nervous system, and that mainly involves voluntary activities, things that you think about and that you can do. If you want to move your arm, that's the somatic nervous system. They also control some unconscious movements called reflexes. And a reflex is a very rapid motor response. It's not directed from the brain. The autonomic nervous system, they tend to run the glands and the internal organs. Like when you eat something, you don't have to worry about the muscles in your stomach working the way they should. They just do. And those are under the control of the autonomic nervous system. So make sure you read about this and get the flavor of that. Now, in this section 17.1, we're going to talk a little bit about the senses. We're going to talk about your eyes and your ears. We'll mention the mouth, nose, and skin, but all of those are sensory receptors that need to send electrical impulses up to your brain so your brain can make sense of them. For example, let's take a look at this one. Here is a cross-section of your eye, looking down on your eye, where there's the pupil right here, but there's a lens, and that lens basically bends the light of all that you're seeing coming into your eye, and it focuses on a retina, which is back here. And then it sends an electrical signal up the optic nerve to your brain, and your brain makes sense of it. The eye is an amazing organ. Your ear is too. So let's go back for a second. What's coming into the eye? It's light energy. So light energy is converted into electrical energy that's sent up to your brain. Your ear, on the other hand, has sound waves coming into it. That's the form of energy coming in here. It hits the eardrum, and then it vibrates these bones over here, which send ripples into a liquid here, which then go up the auditory nerve to your brain, which again makes sense of it up there. Taste buds on your tongue also have receptors, and there are odor receptors on the top of your nasal passages. All of these turn chemicals, these two turn chemicals into electrical signals. Our brain makes sense of it. It's an amazing organ. Now, drugs in the nervous system, here are some examples of psychoactive drugs. Caffeine, tea, cola, coffee, hot cocoa, and approximately how many milligrams of that substance is in, let's say, an 8-ounce cup of coffee. Make sure you read through this section. There's some things that can go wrong with the nervous system, vascular disorders, for example, where a stroke might occur, nervous tissue where you might become infected with microorganisms like meningitis. So read through this and read through the lesson summary that we have on section 17.1. The nervous system is an amazing system. Your brain, you have to take care of it. Always wear a helmet. See you at 17.2.